How did the United States, the world's mightiest superpower, lose the Vietnam War? Welcome to Defensive Global. I'm Deepak Singh, and today we dive into a conflict that shook America's dominance on the global stage. Join me as we uncover the gripping story of the Vietnam War and how it changed the course of history by handing the U.S. one of its most unexpected defeats. War and delve deep into the reasons why the U.S., after 20 years of involvement, could not secure a victory. The war, which began in the 1950s, concluded in 1975 when the Communist forces of North Vietnam captured Saigon, marking the fall of South Vietnam. But what went so terribly wrong for the most powerful nation in the world? Let's take a journey back into history to uncover this. The roots of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War may have started in the 1950s, but its roots run deep into the late 19th century. In 1887, France established its colonial rule over a region called French Indochina, which included Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Enter Ho Chi Minh, who would eventually lead North Vietnam to victory. Trained in the Soviet Union and inspired by communist ideologies, Ho Chi Minh was determined to rid Vietnam of colonial rule. In 1945, following the defeat of Japan in World War II, France sought to re-establish control over Vietnam. However, Ho Chi Minh and his forces declared independence in North Vietnam, and conflict ensued. France's defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 marked the end of French colonialism in Vietnam. But the U.S. was about to step in, convinced by the domino theory, the belief that if one Southeast Asian nation fell to communism, others would quickly follow. Cold War tensions and the U.S. entry. As the Cold War intensified, China and the Soviet Union began providing substantial aid to North Vietnam, backing Ho Chi Minh. In response, the United States threw its support behind South Vietnam. Initially, the U.S. involvement was limited to military aid and advisory roles. But everything changed in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The U.S. accused North Vietnamese forces of attacking the USS Maddox. Using this incident, President Lyndon B. Johnson secured congressional approval to escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam, bringing combat troops into the conflict by 1965. U.S. boots on the ground, initial successes, turned to stalemate. By 1969, there were over 500,000 U.S. troops stationed in Vietnam. The U.S. military initially saw some successes, but these victories were short-lived. The North Vietnamese employed brilliant guerrilla tactics, utilizing the dense jungles to their advantage. The Viet Cong, with their deep knowledge of the terrain and their unyielding resolve, made it nearly impossible for the U.S. forces to secure lasting control. The turning point, the Tet Offensive and erosion of public support. In 1968, the war took a shocking turn with the Tet Offensive, a series of surprise attacks by North Vietnamese forces on more than 100 cities in South Vietnam, including Saigon. The sight of North Vietnamese troops breaching the U.S. Embassy's defenses shattered the American public's confidence in the war effort. Back home, the U.S. public, already growing weary of the conflict, became fiercely anti-war. Images of civilian casualties, especially the infamous My Lai massacre, where over 500 Vietnamese civilians were brutally killed by U.S. forces, further eroded support for the war. Massive protests rocked America, forcing President Johnson to halt bombing in North Vietnam and to declare that he wouldn't run for re-election. The fall of Saigon, the end of the Vietnam War. In 1969, Richard Nixon came to power, promising to end the war through a policy of Vietnamization, which involved slowly withdrawing U.S. troops while training and equipping the South Vietnamese army to take over the fight. However, despite these efforts, the South Vietnamese forces were no match for the Communist North. By 1973, the U.S. had officially pulled out of the conflict, but the war was far from over. In 1975, Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces, marking the official end of the war and the unification of Vietnam under a communist government. Why did the U.S. lose? There were multiple reasons why the U.S. failed in Vietnam. Lack of local support. The South Vietnamese government was unpopular, corrupt, and struggled to win the hearts of its own people. The North, on the other hand, framed their cause as a nationalist struggle, which resonated deeply with the population. Guerrilla warfare. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces excelled in guerrilla tactics, exploiting the difficult jungle terrain and often blending in with the civilian population, making it hard for U.S. forces to distinguish friend from foe. Support from China and the Soviet Union. North Vietnam received significant aid from both China and the USSR, including weapons, training, and supplies, allowing them to sustain their war effort despite massive U.S. bombardments. Political instability in South Vietnam. South Vietnam was plagued by political infighting and coups, with 12 governments rising and falling between 1963 and 1965. This instability weakened the South's war effort. Anti-war sentiment in the U.S. Back in America, the Vietnam War became increasingly unpopular, particularly after events like the Tet Offensive and the release of the Pentagon Papers, which revealed that the U.S. government had been misleading the public about the war's progress. Massive protests against the war made it politically untenable for the U.S. to continue fighting. Cost of the war. Vietnam became a financial burden for the U.S. Despite its vast resources, the U.S. could not afford to keep up the fight indefinitely without raising taxes or cutting back on domestic programs, both of which were unpopular options. Conclusion: a war lost on multiple fronts. In the end, the Vietnam War was not just a military defeat, but a political and social failure for the United States. The inability to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people, combined with rising domestic opposition, made it impossible for the U.S. to secure a lasting victory. As Lumber General Arthur Collins once said, no matter how much the U.S. supported South Vietnam, without their will to fight, victory was impossible. Thank you for watching this detailed breakdown of how the U.S. lost the Vietnam War. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Defensive Global for more deep dives into the world's most significant conflicts and military strategies.